Yo guys, welcome back to another video. Good to be here. And so you guys will have seen the title, hopefully, or maybe you've just checked out whatever the thumbnail is, and we're going to be talking about a key variable for muscle growth, one that I don't see really spoken about in the way that I tend to think about it, and that is stimulus. So I think a lot of you guys listening probably have heard of the stimulus to fatigue ratio, which I think is a fantastic concept, one that is just so applicable to everything that we do in the gym as bodybuilders. And I think it has implications on the short term, medium term, long term, has implications for periodization. It is a concept I use as a trainee and as a coach a heck of a lot. And so I'm going to be talking about it today in a way that I think is really pertinent and might give you some food for thought when you're going about your own training and programming. So there seems to be maybe two camps, and let's say two camps. We're going to say the Mike Mentzer camp, intensity, training to failure. That is the key variable, kind of load on the bar, this sort of intensity camp. And then we have maybe the Arnold Schwarzenegger camp. So this is volume, this is higher reps, this is potentially leaving reps in reserve type of style of training where it causes less fatigue. Maybe we can do even more, get a better growth stimulus. Whereas these guys are very certain that that's just unnecessary. Maybe it leads to junk volume, what have you, and maybe straw manning some arguments and kind of putting people in a position that they don't hold. But I'm just kind of giving you that framework as these kind of two ends of the extreme. And as you guys will know, it doesn't matter how hard you train. If you don't do enough, you're not going to grow. And even a set is volume driven, right? But then you have also this end, you could be training like an absolute pansy, leaving 2 reps in reserve. And we all see those people in the gym that don't really change because they just go through the motions within the gym. Whether or not that's their goal, it's the case that that's happening. So there has to be one of the two, like they come together. And this is where the idea of like hard sets came in. So anything that is close to failure counts as a hard set. The more hard sets you can do that you can recover from, the more growth that you'll get. And that to a large extent is a really, really good proxy for muscle growth and very, very helpful. However, it doesn't miss another element that all of you will be more than aware of. And that's in a easy way to explain it is basically exercise selection. So I see stimulus as including relative intensity, so how close to failure are we training, volume, how many sets are we doing, and then we're talking about like exercise selection. Those 3 elements make up a stimulus that we're providing ourselves. So a way to think about this, and why am I including like exercise selection? You think about if we're talking about hard sets, and you say, as an example, I need 10 hard sets to grow my quads in the week. That leaves a lot of questions, and also given you data, you could argue, well, is that 10 sets to failure, or is that 10 sets with 3 or 4 reps in reserve? Like that's a different stimulus in its own right. And then also, where are those sets coming from? Are they coming from leg extensions? Are they coming from squats? Are they coming from leg press? What's the combination here? A set of leg extensions taken to failure does not equal a set of squats taken to failure for the quads. It's a different stimulus. So I think it's important to think about stimulus. And not talk about these individual considerations. So stimulus is taking into consideration not the amount, just the amount we do. It's also taking in how hard do we do it and how do we apply that stimulus as well. So I use this analogy of like if a business wants to grow, it's not about just how many people they have in the business. It's about how hard they work, but it's also about the quality of their work. And that comes together to give you their overall growth stimulus. You can have tons of people in your business, but if they don't work hard, it's not ideal. You can have very few people in your business and work hard, but if it's not of a high quality, and I mean, you don't have many people, you're not going to get much of a growth stimulus. So those kind of 3 combination factors lead to the overall growth stimulus. So I'm talking about number of sets, how hard are we doing those, and what's the application of those, i.e. exercise selection. That defines stimulus. So to provide an example of a situation where we could get possibly a very similar stimulus, but through different means. So it could be that 4 sets of squats to failure is equivocal roughly to 4 sets of squats and 2 sets of leg extensions to a 3 RIR each. That could be roughly the same stimulus. And then again, another way of getting to that stimulus could be 2 sets of squats to 3 RIR, 2 sets of leg press to a 2 RIR, and sissy squats to end to failure. That could be roughly the same as your 4 squats to failure or your 4 squats and 2 sets of leg extensions to a 3 RAR. They could roughly be equivocal. I think you're basically like piecing together different combinations of, okay, exercise selection, intensity, and also volume. What's best? That's going to be very different, and it might be individual dependent in terms of what you respond best to, what you feel like you respond best to, where you've seen the best results. It could be preferences, like do you prefer just higher intensities, or do you prefer doing more volume, having more exercise selection? And it will largely come down to what is the fatigue side of this equation. I don't think we have really obvious answers to this, and I think we also know that the overarching principles in each 3 of these examples are there. Are we getting sufficient volume? Are we getting sufficient intensity? Relative, because we know we can work with a wide set of rep ranges. I'm kind of talking about this 5 to 30 rep range, if we can use that. Are we getting those? And then obviously, many of you will be thinking, but in some of these examples, variation is higher, and that probably could lead to better results. That's also a thing. So leg extensions, we're getting the rec fem in there. Sissy squats, we're getting the rec fem in there. So maybe the 4 sets of squats to failure is not the best. This is a very isolated example. I'm trying to provide a point. Obviously, there is the microcycle, so what exercises are you doing through the week? There's then the longer term periodization scheme. Maybe you don't have leg extensions in your microcycle in this meso, but next meso you do. So there's a variety of factors. I'm just trying to provide a point to say this is why stimulus is important to think about versus just volume or just like intensity or whatever, because there's these 3 factors that come to build an overall muscle growth stimulus. So I understand there's problems with stimulus. It is subjective, and I use it more as a thought process versus like an objective tool that we can use to be like, we need to get 80 stimulus this week, and then next week 85, and then whatever. Like, this is not how I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking it more in like just a theoretical model, because easy to calculate things are nice and ideas are nice, but they in themselves can lead to problems. So an easy way to think about this for a lot of you guys will like basing your calorie needs off a calorie calculator. We know that that is not the ideal way to do things. You can put in a variety of kind of factors, but everyone's individual, and there will be kind of numbers spat out that will just be completely wrong for you. Better is to weigh in, track your food, and then you'll have an average amount of calories you're consuming, an average scale weight trend, and you get an idea of what energy balance you're in. But even with that, it's not completely objective, because it has influences that can impact it that make it a little more challenging to use it as a perfect like tool. For example, if you change what you eat and it has higher sodium, you could have much more water retention the next day. That could lead to a spike in weight. That doesn't necessarily reflect energy balance though. So you have to, with all of these things, we can make them as objective as possible, but no, there's always going to be these outside influences that can muddy the waters. It's still a framework. Now, I think in the kind of evidence-based community, the tool most people use is volume. That's the thing I used for the longest time. If I had a client, and I still use it to some extent, don't get me wrong, but with the understanding of stimulus too, is if you have a client come to you and they want to grow muscle, they don't really know what program they've been following before, what volumes they do well with, you use kind of science as a starting point, and that evidence-based kind of recommendation of 10 to 20 sets per week can provide very great growth for you, is a decent framework. But again, that leads, if people just to take that at face value, that leads to people thinking, so I could do like 10 sets of leg extensions, and like that then doesn't take into proximities to failure and those variety of factors. And so this is why I think it's important to like have this idea of stimulus involved too, because again, if you do 10 sets of leg extensions to a 3 or 4 RAR, I mean, you're probably going to see some growth from that. A lot of people will, but I don't think it's probably what we intend to be doing in that situation. And obviously there's these ideas that, like maybe you should have an emphasis on compound lifts, and certainly there should be compound lifts within your program. They should be core fundamentals, absolutely. But that's just ideas pulled from like general understandings and not from that necessary kind of number that we provide in terms of 10 to 20 sets. So the important questions that you're kind of, when you are thinking about 10 to 20 sets, is then what is the proximity to failure? And then what also exercises am I selecting? They're important things to have a think about for sure. Because even if, as an example, this is a really simple example, you come into week 1 of your program off a deload, you haven't done walking lunges or a lunge pattern in ages. Just anyone who's trained for a long time knows if you do a bunch of sets close to failure of that, you're going to be sore for a heck of a long time. So you know that it's not wise to start off with a lot of that. Imagine, again, someone coming to this, they're like, oh, I really think Bulgarian split squats are great for glute and quad growth. I'm going to do 10 sets, all to failure, week 1. It's like, that meets this kind of paradigm, right? And then the fatigue or the stimulus is too much. It just leads to problems. So this is where this understanding comes in, where it's like, okay, some things are like more novel in that short term. And so we need some adaptive adaptive processes to go on before we start thinking about like the stimulus quickly comes down, so we can add a set maybe the next week. We only have 1 set in there for the first week. These are just things you learn via experience and also understanding of stimulus. So you might be thinking, great, Steve, kind of understand where you're coming from. Using just volume can lead to problems. Having an understanding of where my relative intensity is, and also further past hard sets, because as a recent meta-analysis kind of provided, and we know also from past meta-analyses that as you approach failure, there's more fatigue. So that's one thing to consider, but also as you approach failure, there's probably an increase in the amount of stimulus you get. So that's also something you have to take into consideration. To some extent, it's not like night and day, but a 3 or 4 to a 1 to 0 is probably quite different enough to have an impact there. And then when we're thinking about it too, it's exercise selection, which is just obvious to us that has to be somewhat of a consideration. So now, how do we use it? First, understanding that it's just a framework. So it comes as that combination of volume, intensity, and then exercise selection. And then I like short-term proxies for this that can give you an understanding of it. You will have heard these, very much popularized by Renaissance Periodization, Mike Israetel, and I think they're great tools in a kind of experienced lifters toolkit or as a coach to get your clients to understand them. And that is because these proxies are correlated often with things that lead to lots of muscle growth. So we're talking about soreness. And that's a proxy not just because soreness can be an indicator that you've caused a overload to a certain muscle, but also that if you're not recovered in time for a next session, you might be overdoing stimulus as an idea. Not all muscles get sore, so you have to use all of these in combination. Then we have pump. Obviously, if you're driving lots of kind of blood to a certain muscle, you know you're working that muscle really, really well. There's a reason Arnold Schwarzenegger was such a fan of the pump, because he saw that correlation himself. And there is some indirect evidence and building evidence, I think, that the pump, that there's something there. It's certainly correlated. It's not something to just completely ignore. I also know some of my best pumps have come once, and with the best pumps have then seen growth with that muscle where I wasn't before, because I just don't think I was using it very well during lifts. I think probably some of you listening can recognize that. I know for my calves, as an example, one of them I didn't have a good mind muscle connection. It never got good pumps. And once I got that, I was like, oh, now I can actually use my calf, and then saw some growth. And then local muscle fatigue. So you will know, for example, the quads, they tend to get a pretty gnarly pump. Whereas like the hamstrings, they kind of just feel tight, tired, fatigued, maybe sore. But local muscular fatigue is also a helpful indicator of, okay, how is the stimulus for that muscle group that you're targeting? An actual objective way that you can sometimes see this within your program is set 1 to 2, how much of my reps dropped off, or set 2 to 3, whatever it is. You can, if they drop off a lot, you know you've created a lot of fatigue in that muscle. Assuming you've rested long enough and you've not done anything kind of ridiculous there, you know you've caused a lot of fatigue. And we see this because we know as you train to failure, reps drop off really steeply after it, which is why sometimes people advise don't train to failure on the first set, especially on big compound lifts where it can just destroy a workout. But that's because it's just created systemic fatigue, but also local muscular fatigue, especially on like isolation-based movements. Anyway, then we can move on to the idea of kind of where we're trying to be. So you want to start out like a mesocycle, start your training periods after you've come off a deload, generating what I would just term as like a moderate stimulus. You want to go in to the gym, train hard, and leave the gym feeling like you've trained pretty hard, but you know you've got more in the tank. That's as simple as it gets. This is very similar to training at minimum effective volume. Minimal effective volume. So the least volume you need to grow. I'm kind of reterming it in a sense. I've talked about this on various podcasts before. We're thinking about minimum effective stimulus. I just think volume, again, can lead to some which is why stimulus becomes a little bit more effective. And that also, can just be beneficial in that sense. So we're looking for moderate elements of some of those short-term proxies. And then from there, you can progressively overload. So whether or not you're looking to like add a rep or like a small additional amount of load, you just look to progressively overload through the mesocycle, and you can auto-regulate some of your stimulus via set addition or subtraction even. And that can be really, really helpful as well, because you adapt and maybe the stimulus diminishes a little bit and you want a little bit more. And the goal really here, and the goal of hypertrophy, is to maintain as good of a stimulus, so like a more than moderate, maybe a medium, like solid stimulus for as long as possible. Because if you have a high stimulus, you might not recover in time. And if you run high for like, it's like you'd probably need to deload and back off sooner than you otherwise would like to. So by starting out, kind of giving yourself lots of runway, if I can say the word right, then you can milk out this kind of moderate stimulus, this medium stimulus for a long, long period of time before, again, you're looking to advance it. And eventually you kind of come to this point of which you've accumulated a lot of fatigue, which means you need to back off at some point. So again, you can think about that. And like some people might pick, okay, I'm going to go lower volume, higher relative intensities, mix my exercise selection or whatever. Or you might do a combination of things. And I do think fatigue is where that combination becomes most interesting into what provides us the stimulus we want for the least fatigue cost. And this is where things like I've talked about length and partials come in. Yeah, they provide much more stimulus potentially, but what's the fatigue cost? If it's very similar, then we're getting heightened stimulus for lesser fatigue, which is really cool. And that might not apply to all muscle groups, for all exercises. It's just interesting stuff. And same with the stimulus to fatigue trade-off of proximities to failure. 2 RAR might generate the best stimulus fatigue trade-off on average, but then does that differ for different times? For example, exercises at times, some of them can be more stimulating and less fatiguing, but as you drive that movement for months and months and months, the stimulus maybe starts diminishing, the fatigue starts accumulating, you get joint pains and things, you rotate it. Same with these principles can all work on that kind of longer term scale as well. Maybe after a deload, the best stimulus to fatigue trade-off is leaving more reps in reserve. But as you adapt to training and we need to keep moving forward, that you couldn't just stick it like a 3 or 4 RAR forever. Like you need to progressively overloading approach closer. So anyway, these are just ideas, concepts, and I wanted to get this one out there. Hopefully some of you think it's interesting. I just have been thinking about it for a long time, spat out some ideas this morning, made a little bit of a script for myself, and I'm interested in any feedback to it. If you found it helpful, let me know. If you have any questions, let me know. If you've got any thoughts, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, if you haven't yet, definitely subscribe. We appreciate you. Give me a like. I appreciate it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.